1964. In 1978, Jim Rankin became the Director of the Drug and Alcohol Division within the Health Commission of New South Wales. In 1994, Jim became Chair of the Central Sydney Area Drug and Alcohol Service and a clinical professor at the University of Sydney. In 1999, he moved on to work as Senior Staff Specialist in the Northern Rivers Area Health Service in New South Wales to assist in the further development of the drug and alcohol services until his retirement in 2000. And many of you will be aware he is still an active contributor to our conferences and attends them regularly. This year, the James Rankin Oration will be delivered by Professor Alison Ritter. Alison Ritter is an internationally recognised drug policy scholar and the Director of the Drug Policy Modelling Program at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre at the University of New South Wales. She is NHMRC Senior Research Fellow leading a multidisciplinary program of research on drug policy. The goal of the work is to advance drug policy through improving evidence base, translating research and studying policy processes. Professor Ritter worked as a clinical psychologist in the alcohol and drug field prior to commencing full-time research. She's contributed significant policy and practice developments in the alcohol and drug sector over many years. She's the President of the International Society for the Study of Drug Policy, Vice President of the Alcohol and Drug Council of Australia, and an editor for a number of journals, including the Drug and Alcohol Review and International Journal of Drug Policy. Professor Ritter has an extensive research grant track record and has published widely in the field. We're also very privileged to have had Alison serve on APSAD Council and as APSAD President in the past. So now I'd like to welcome Alison to come to talk to us about challenges of policy research. Thank you, Alison.
Thank you very much. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders both past and present. Thank you very much. This is going to be an interesting presentation. Thank you very much, Rose. Can I also thank the APSAD Council for selecting me as the 2014 James Rankin Orator. Rose has already spoken about Jim Rankin, so that's saved me at least 3 minutes of my presentation, which is lucky. Jim Rankin has made an extraordinary contribution to the field of alcohol and other drug research, as Rose has outlined, and was one of the founding fathers of the professional society, APSAD. I think we, as a sector, owe Jim a debt of honour, and in particular, I personally do. Many people won't know that Jim Rankin was actually one of my PhD examiners, and luckily he thought it was a reasonably good PhD and passed it. So personally, I'm very grateful for James Rankin's work and contributions. I'm going to be talking about reflections on policy research that aims to make a difference. And I'm going to be using the experience of the Drug Policy Modelling Program. This year, the DPMP is 10 years old. We commenced in 2004 at Turning Point Alcohol and Drug Centre in Melbourne. And so we've been going now for 10 years, and I think it's a nice opportunity to reflect on what we've learned, what we've done well, what some of the challenges and issues have been. The DPMP is quite a big team, as you can see here. There's been many people associated with the Drug Policy Modelling Program over the last 10 years. I'm going to be talking about some of our work as part of DPMP and some research that members of this particular team have done. But all of the interpretation and analysis and the challenges that I would mention are my own. No DPMP member should feel responsible for anything that I say as part of this oration. The Drug Policy Modelling Program has as its aim to enable policymakers to respond with alacrity and success in relation to alcohol and other drugs. This is what we wrote in the original grant application just before 2004, and it remains our core kind of aim of DPMP. It's a multidisciplinary program. It's highly collaborative with researchers around Australia, with service providers, peak bodies across Australia, as well as with governments. And our focus is entirely upon making a difference. DPMP is characterised by three streams of activity. The first stream of activity is generating new evidence. We want to generate new evidence that's timely, relevant and useful for policymakers. It's all well and good to generate new evidence, and in fact the APSAD program is an excellent example, I think, of all sorts of new evidence that gets generated across the entire alcohol and drug research arena. But it's not enough just to generate new evidence. One does need to actively translate that evidence. And the second stream of DPMP is concerned with translation, studying how we translate things, working on different methods of translation, and trying to improve the way in which research evidence gets translated from the research environment into the applied policy environment. We can generate as much research evidence as we like, and we can translate that evidence in outstandingly excellent ways, but that doesn't mean it's going to make a difference. And that's because policy processes don't rely exclusively on evidence, and nor should they, as I will argue later in this paper. So our third stream is about understanding policy and the policy process and the multiple influences that occur in any one policy decision-making process. So that's the three streams of DPMP. This paper is now going to proceed. I'm going to take each stream and give you a couple of examples of some work, talk about making a difference, and then identify challenges and key issues that I hope will be stimulating and thought-provoking for all of us. So the first stream, generating new evidence. Here are some examples of some projects. So the first project is work by Tu Vong. She's a Vietnamese PhD student with DPMP. She's conducting an economic evaluation which compares the compulsory centre-based drug treatment programs in Vietnam with community methadone maintenance treatment. The second example is the review that we completed with Jenny Chalmers and Linda Behrens, who are both here, on the alcohol and other drug treatment services. If you want to learn more about that, that's being presented in a symposium this afternoon. The third example is work from Michael Livingston. His work on the relationship between socioeconomic status and alcohol consumption in Australia is another DPMP project under generating new evidence, and that's being presented tomorrow. Go along and hear Michael's paper. And there's lots and lots of others like this. So some of the issues that I wanted to draw out. The first is the issue of the relevance of the research question. So clearly some research questions are highly relevant, incredibly timely, and right on in terms of a policymaker making a decision. And it would be terrific if we did all of our research around that space. But sometimes there are important research questions that aren't asked by policymakers, and some work that is about generating a body of knowledge. The example in this instance is Michael Livingston's work around socioeconomic status and alcohol. Everyone knows about the importance of the social determinants of health, health disparities, inequalities and so on. Whilst this piece of work might not lend itself directly to policymakers making a decision, we need to do something in this policy space, and this kind of work contributes to the body of knowledge around the importance of some active policy around issues to do with health disparities. Tu Vung's PhD, on the other hand, is of highly direct relevance to the Vietnamese government at present. For those that don't know, Vietnam is moving out of a situation of being a developing country. Its aid is being reduced, and the Vietnamese government will need to make its own decisions about what kinds of drug treatment it will be funding and supporting. And we hope that that research will contribute to the Vietnamese government making good decisions about how it invests in drug treatment into the future. There's a difference between commissioned research and investigator-driven research along similar lines. Commissioned research is when we're asked to do something on behalf of government. They ask the research question. The chances of commissioned research having a high impact are quite good because it's a relevant question that a policymaker is asking. At the same time, it's very important to continue what we call investigator-driven research. And I think all of us as researchers and as a community need to get the balance right between investigator-driven research and commissioned research. A third point I'd like to make under this first stream of generating new evidence is in relation to the relationship between research and policy. In an ideal world, we would like to think that there was an instrumental relationship where we develop the research and then it gets translated directly into policy. And there are examples where that does occur, and I'm about to talk you through one. But more often than not, there's a whole lot of other things that occur. But when the stars align, we do get an opportunity to make a difference with new research evidence. Come in. There's lots of spare seats. They're in the middle though, so you need to crawl across legs. It's a bit like getting into an aeroplane if you haven't got the aisle seat. No worries. This is work that Caitlin Hughes has led in the Australian Capital Territory in relation to legal thresholds for drug offences. Most of you might know this, but in Australia, along with a limited number of other countries, our laws specify the quantity, the grams of drug when someone is caught that determine what they're charged with. So a certain amount of grams determines whether they're charged as a user or whether they're charged as a dealer or trafficker or wholesaler or whatever. So these laws which specify the thresholds, which are state jurisdictionally based laws, are incredibly important for just, proportionate and fair police action in relation to illicit drugs. There has been a long history of the review of the threshold laws in Australia to little avail at a federal level. However, the ACT bravely sought to review their legal thresholds, and they invited DPMP to conduct research to generate evidence for what those thresholds should be. The research that Caitlin led identified 5 different metrics or pieces of evidence to suggest what the threshold should be for different drug types. Obviously, we wanted to know what are the current patterns of use and do they match what the thresholds are. What are the patterns of drug purchasing behaviour by people who use drugs, not by people who sell drugs? We also wanted to know what the retail value of each purchase would be to contribute to the evidence base for the laws. And the final 2 metrics, harmfulness and social cost, we believe that the way in which our laws are constructed should take into account the extent to which a drug is regarded as harmful and the extent to which it carries a significant burden of social cost. So we collected these 5 metrics, we did a whole bunch of analyses, and we concluded our report with the following recommendation: that the threshold quantities for MDMA and cocaine should be higher and the threshold quantities for heroin and methamphetamine should be lower. We presented that work to the Attorney General and we did briefings and a report and so on. Now, it wasn't just DPMP that was doing this work. At the same time and following the submission of our report, there were important activities and other key players in this policy space. That includes ACT Health, who were very engaged, ATODA. ATODA's the NGO peak body in the ACT, CARMA, which is the user group, and people like David McDonald. All of these people were also working around collecting information, contributing to a better informed policy around the thresholds. It's fabulous to be able to let you know, if you don't already, that the thresholds were changed. They were changed consistent with our recommendations and the other advice they'd been given from other people, and they came into effect in April of this year. And those changes were exactly consistent with the evidence base that we'd been presented with. this is the kind of example where you just realise how privileged you are to be in a position of generating evidence that makes a difference and has the potential to really change drug policy and change the lives of people who use drugs. But it's not all beer and skittles. For every research project that we've done that's had that kind of impact and made a direct difference, I can give you 4 or 5 other research projects that haven't been taken up. And there's lots of reasons for that, and I'll explore some of those throughout this paper. One particular example I think I'd use is, as many people know, I've done a lot of work around opioid pharmacotherapy maintenance over the years. As part of DPMP, we've done 2 pieces of research published by the Australian National Council, funded and published by the Australian National Council on Drugs. We've also conducted a number of commissioned research projects for New South Wales and Victorian health departments. Despite a wealth of generating new research evidence, pharmacotherapy maintenance still has some palpable issues in Australia. Dispensing fees, clinical guidelines around takeaway doses, and of course substantial unmet need, unmet demand, in particular locations across Australia. So have we not translated that pharmacotherapy's work, and what other influences have impacted? I'm going to turn to translation now and some of the challenges associated with translating research as our second stream. So some examples of DPMP translational work. We use models, we build models which simulate important policy decisions, and the first 2 are examples of our modelling work. The first one, which Fung Hong is working on, is an NHMRC funded research project which is looking at the career of people who use heroin. So it's a model of 40 years of heroin use with people moving in and out of active heroin use, in and out of treatment, in and out of health, and so on. And it's an economic evaluation. It's translational because we're not collecting new data. We're relying on all of the work that people here have done, including the Australian Treatment Outcome Study that I know has been presented at the conference, and with Marie Thiessen and her team, and Paul Dietz's work from Melbourne, the Melbourne Injecting Cohort Study, the MIX. So we don't collect new data, we take existing data and we translate it into a form that can be used by policymakers. The idea with this model is that it's a simulation of the heroin career, and policymakers can test different amounts of treatment, for example, or different variables in that. SimDrug is a very similar model. This is a policing model, it's a street-based heroin market, where we're simulating the purchasing heroin and police activity. If people have played SimCity or know that, these models are quite similar to that. We do not have the fancy interface. We don't get ATVARs and give them names and so on. But the notion is that these models simulate the real world such that they can be used as games to test policy options that otherwise you can't test in the real world. A third and quite different example, this is not a modelling example, but it's another translational example, is our review of pay-for-performance purchasing. This review was done as part of the Commonwealth commissioned Alcohol and Other Drug Treatment Review. Again, we didn't collect new data, but we analysed the literature with the result that there is no evidence that pay-for-performance or payment by results would be an appropriate, useful or sensible model to deploy in Australia. And if you'd like to hear me bang on some more about that, I'll be doing that this afternoon as part of my translational activities from that project. So some of the issues that I wanted to raise, I've talked about modelling. So importantly, DPMP uses models as a translational tool. We don't use these for hypothesis-driven research or for forecasting, even though that's a more common use of modelling. We engage extensively in other translational activities, and we've studied how policymakers access research evidence. So we know, for example, that being on the end of the phone is the most common way in which policymakers access research evidence, and reading academic papers is very low down on the list. I wanted to say something about the place of media in translation. I think there's no question that media is fundamentally important and more important these days. I think there are two reasons why doing media is important. The first is that doing good media actually informs public opinion, and public opinion is a driver of policy. So one of the reasons we do media is to have a better informed public so that they can understand the issues better and have an informed opinion about the sensitive issues that are alcohol and other drug policies. Second reason for doing media is that politicians are extensive consumers of the media, and it's a surefire way of getting your research in front of a politician if you put it in the media. The challenges and the risks. Oversimplification, misrepresentation, and problem amplification. It's very challenging to summarise a complicated piece of research down into a soundbite. And the risk that we face as researchers is that we oversimplify to the point where it actually misrepresents the research. The second problem that I wanted to highlight was that I think it's fair to assume that we need to convince politicians or policymakers that there's a problem for which we have the solution. Now, this is not always the case. You can have solutions that don't have problems. But in our endeavour to get a policy solution up, I think there's a real risk that we amplify the problem in the first place. I don't want to suggest that oversimplification, misrepresentation and problem amplification are necessarily deliberate or conscious activities on behalf of any of us as researchers, but I think they are things that we need to be alert to and mindful of, particularly when we're working in, for example, the difficult media space, but also when we're writing our papers for journals and writing an abstract that needs to be eye-catching and grab the attention of a readership. So it's not just in the media space, but I think it's in all the work we do in terms of making a difference. It would be entirely remiss of me to give a presentation on making a difference if I didn't talk about advocacy. Advocacy is regarded as a very tainted and sort of dirty word, I think, at the moment. Some researchers regard advocacy as absolutely fundamental. There's no point doing research if you're not engaged with advocacy. And other researchers regard it as an activity that is not appropriate, sensible or professional on behalf of researchers. And there's a great paper by Haynes listed there if you want to look at some of the views around advocacy from the public health research community. I think the problem that we have is we have a very unsophisticated understanding of advocacy, and we think about it as either doing advocacy or not. Whereas in reality I think there's a spectrum that moves from providing information up to persuasion, and how we manage where we sit on that spectrum is actually what's really important. The Overseas Development Institute, and if you haven't come across ODI, they are fantastic. They're not in the drug and alcohol space. Their website's great. They've got a whole lot of sort of tools and information, and I think this chart is really helpful for us. So it's got two axes. On the horizontal axis is whether you are inside or outside the system or government. So on this side you're inside government, and on this side you're outside, you're on the outside track. And then it's got a second axis, the vertical axis, which is evidence or science up the top and interests or values based down the bottom. Now I will come back and argue about them not being two ends of the spectrum but actually being together. But for the purposes of this discussion about advocacy, I think what's important is that there are 4 quadrants, and we all sit in different quadrants at different points in time, whether we know it or not. So up here is advising. This is on the inside track, and it's driven by evidence or scientific findings. So we call that, or ODI at any rate, calls that advising. Advocacy, on the other hand, is when you're on the outside track, promoting evidence or science. Lobbying is when you're on the inside track and it's driven by interests or values. And activism is when you're on the outside track, driven by interests and values. Feel free to come in and grab a seat for the people that are there. It's no problem at all. So I think what's important is knowing which quadrant you're in at any one point in time. So if you're here in the advising, you're on the inside track and evidence, your strategy is actually to get other people who are in the advocacy, activism or lobbying track. Provide them with the information and let them do what they do well. If you're in the advocacy quadrant, let's say, find someone who's in the advising quadrant and get them to do that. We can't all be experts at doing all of these different things, and what it is about partnerships and collaborations and working with organisations. So I would encourage you all to work out where you are at any one point in time for any particular piece of translational work that you're doing, and then find a group, an individual or a community that's in one of the other quadrants. That way I think we will have much more effective translation of our research into policy. But it's not all beer and skittles. You can be doing the advising and have someone else reporting your results in the advocacy space. And I'm going to give you an example of lies and damn statistics. Now this is not in reference to Marion Shanahan's PhD, this is in reference to how her PhD can be used. So Marion Shanahan, as part of DPMP, bravely undertook a study of cannabis legalisation. She compared a legal regime of cannabis that was a government monopoly in New South Wales with the current status quo in New South Wales, which is decriminalisation. And as an economist, she did a net social benefit analysis. Net social benefit collects all of the costs and all of the benefits for legalisation and collects all of the costs and the benefits for status quo, and then compares the two numbers and says which one's bigger. Whichever one's bigger is the better policy. The net social benefit for the status quo was $294 million. The good news is it's a positive number. Sometimes net social benefit are negative numbers, which are policies that are costly overall rather than beneficial. The net social benefit for decriminalisation was $234 million. These were not significantly different from each other. Bom bom. Disappointment for many of the advocates in relation to cannabis legalisation. The issue is whether you include revenue. So revenue from the sale of cannabis is a significant economic benefit to the New South Wales government. Indeed, if you include the revenue from the sale of cannabis under the government monopoly model that Marion was testing, the net social benefit for the legalised regulated model is $727 million. Woohoo! You're hugely different from $290 million. The problem is that the revenue from cannabis is regarded as a transfer. So it's not included in a net social benefit, and by transfer what that means is that money is already circulating in the New South Wales economy. It's just circulating in the black market. People are purchasing cannabis and selling cannabis, and that economic activity exists in the black market. If it's shifted to a legalised regulated model, it's the same amount of money, it's just circulating in the government, in the public revenues. So Marion technically correctly and according to all economists did exactly the right thing. She didn't include it in the analysis. People who are keen to advocate on behalf of cannabis legalisation of course want to report the significant $727 million net social benefit for a legal supply of cannabis in New South Wales. To the third stream of studying policy making. So, as I said at the beginning, you can generate as much evidence, and we all do an awful lot of that. You can do as much translation and work with partners and collaborators in the other quadrant kind of spaces. But without understanding the complicated, messy process of policy decision making, we're unlikely to get much traction. Some of the examples of DPMP research in this space is work by Kari Lancaster on public opinion and drug policy. This work was about looking at what do people who use drugs think should be done about drug policy. We tend to survey the general public, but they're actually not the ones that are impacted by specific drug policies. A second project that Caitlin Hughes is involved with is looking at street level policing and the way in which what are the policy processes around street level policing and how do policies come to the fore within the policing environment. And the third example is also Kari's work in relation to understanding how the notion of recovery is constituted, and she presented that paper yesterday. So, making a difference with studying policy. We did a piece of work around the ice epidemic that occurred in 2006-2007. So people will know these were the headlines. The Four Corners program ran a show called The Ice Age in late 2006. There were headlines across the nation. As you can see here, the Ice Age, hospitals snowed under, cold comfort confronting the scourge of the new Ice Age from the Canberra Times, and so on. We decided we should do a careful policy analysis of what happened back then, and that's what we undertook to do, Kari and myself and a collaborator, Hal Colbatch, who's a political scientist. What we found, and I've presented this actually at APSAD before, so this is like a refresher course for those who have heard it. We found that there were two different definitions of what the problem was. On the one hand, we had media and politicians saying the problem is an epidemic. It's a population-wide, national, deadly crisis that is occurring everywhere. And on the other hand, we had a different group of people, researchers, and Louisa Dagenhart led much of this work along with Rebecca McKetton, identifying that the problem was not an epidemic and a national crisis. It was a specific problem amongst people who injected drugs, and the use of crystal methamphetamine and the harms were concentrated amongst this small group of regular drug users. So having analysed what the problem definition was in 2006-07, we then looked at what the solution was. And the predominant solution that was rolled out in 2007-2008 was law enforcement. Precursor controls became the solution. Now, whilst there was $22 million by the Commonwealth put into methamphetamine treatment clinics, that was completely swamped by the $150 to $200 million that was put into law enforcement solutions. At that time, Project Stop had been evaluated, so there was a readily available law enforcement solution. In the methamphetamine treatment space, we couldn't and didn't have a ready treatment solution to propose to address the problem that was vexing our politicians and the community. And in our analysis of this work, we find that there is this match between how the problem gets defined. So if it's an epidemic, precursor controls and law enforcement actually make sense, whereas if you define it as a concentrated problem amongst people who inject drugs, the treatment solution obviously makes sense. So the choice of the problem matches the choice of the available solution, which then matches the politics of the day, which was, of course, a Conservative government, John Howard and tough on drugs. We submitted this work in 2012, and publishing being what it is, it was published in January, February of 2014. Did we have an impact? This is the last few months of media in 2014 in relation to the methamphetamine ice epidemic. These slides come from Nadine Ezard and Sian Hodge from St Vincent's in Sydney. Yes, it's not all beer and Skittles. There are some other challenges in relation to studying the policy process, aside from the fact that sometimes it doesn't make a difference. And I wanted to raise a few of those before I conclude. The first is that there's not, when you're trying to understand what's happened, there's not one single authoritative account of the policy process. So even though we've done this analysis of the 2006-2007 ice epidemic, another research team might come and redo and study that period again and draw some different conclusions. And indeed, someone out there needs to study the difference between the 2006-07 ice epidemic and the 2014 ice epidemic. And if anyone's interested, very keen to talk with you about that. But there's not one single authoritative account. And I mean, one of the examples is the work that we've done in relation to the ACT peer-administered naloxone program that I also know has been talked about and presented here at APSAD. So Kari and myself have published a piece describing that, that policy process, focusing on the kind of collaborative partnerships and the often messy process of developing policy. Simon Lenton and Paul and others have also published an account. They're not actually vastly different, but they do take different perspectives and different narratives, and there isn't a truth in reflecting on policy, what actually happened in policy. The second issue is the challenge of doing this kind of analytic work where you can either study an historical phenomenon or you can study current issues. The advantage of studying something that's happened some time ago is that people are more likely to tell you the truth. In fact, there's a saying, the time to interview politicians is at their point when they've just retired, because that's when you're likely to find out what really happened. At the same time, everyone's recall is generally poor, and in addition, we tend to have narratives that become the story. So I can do the 3-minute version of Bob Hawke, 1985, you know, Nakada, and we all share that narrative. So it's very hard to move away from the sort of shared stories that we have about the past. Analysing a current policy issue, however, as it unfolds, is extremely difficult. It's sensitive, there are secrets, there are things that can't be talked about, rightly so, things that can't be talked about. So that has got its own challenges as well. The last point I'd make in relation to studying policy processes is the problem of wearing multiple hats. I don't think I'm unique in being both a person who is an actor in the policy space with a number of different hats on, including my vice presidency of the Alcohol and Drug Council of Australia, and as a researcher who is studying policy making processes. We're a small sector and many of us are in this kind of position. I think what's really important about that is knowing which hat you've got on at any one point in time and being clear and transparent about that in the process. And the risk is that you get muddled and your constituents, participants, collaborators or audience becomes muddled. And I think that's to the detriment of better alcohol and drug policy. To conclude, it's difficult to summarise all of the aspects of making a difference in relation to policy research. I hope I've given you some examples and things to think about. There's a much greater wealth of experience within the DPMP beyond what I've presented today. I did want to just make some other small comments about some other challenges. The first is this issue of the instrumental relationship between research and policy. There's not always a direct relationship between a piece of research evidence and policy. But when there is, as in the case of the thresholds work, we should celebrate. We should celebrate the success of the influence of policy. And I'm sure there's many people here who have had such successes in their careers, and it's important that we applaud that and celebrate it. At the same time, it's important not to then be dismissive of all of the other work that we do that doesn't have a direct instrumental impact on policy. And I like the term enlightenment, which is used by Carol Weiss to describe the process of knowledge accumulation. All of the work that we do contributes to knowledge and accumulates in ways over time, and there's been a good description of the kind of osmotic process of policy influence where research ideas circulate, percolate, get taken up over time, and you can never sort of sit down and say, well, that piece of research contributed to that particular policy decision-making process. So I would argue we should celebrate our successes and we should take heart in the fact that when there's not such an obvious making a difference, we are still contributing to an important body of knowledge that will continue beyond us. The other thing I wanted to mention was the 3 minutes in a lift with the minister problem. So sometimes when I finish a piece of research, I think, what would happen if the minister said to me, so what should I do? Luckily, I've never actually been stuck in a lift with a minister, so that's lucky. I think this is really hard. I think it's really important that we think about it, and I would ask all of you to think about a current piece of work that you're doing and work out what you would say when the minister says, oh, you're working on that problem, so what should Australian government do, or what should the Tasmanian government do? What would you say? And how do you not oversimplify, misrepresent or amplify the problem? And how do you get a really probably complicated message across in really simple terms? I think it's a good exercise for all of us to engage in, and you can call it the sort of 3 minutes in a lift with the minister exercise. The last thing I wanted to talk about is what happens when we find the wrong answer. Now, some of you will be sitting there thinking, but there are no wrong answers. There is a research question and there is data, and that data will determine the answer, and that's what the answer is. And there's not a right answer and there's not a wrong answer. I beg to differ. I think we do find wrong answers just as much as we find right answers. And that's because research is not an independent, objective, value-free process. We all bring our own views and our own values to what it is that we do, and to deny this, I think, is problematic for all of us. Those of you that were in Suzanne Fraser's presentation yesterday afternoon will know that she called on the theorist Bruno Latour, who has argued that science is a political exercise, and I concur with that. How we choose a research question and how we shape that research question makes a difference and is contributed to by our own values. How we then choose to measure it, which outcome measures we choose, make a difference. And how we choose to analyse it, whether we use structural equation modelling or odds ratios or whatever else, makes a difference to the answers that we get. So I think there's this kind of inherent contradiction that we have to live with. On the one hand, we have the prevailing paradigm of evidence-based policy. Everyone wants evidence-based policy. Our Prime Ministers talk about evidence-based policy. Our official policy documents talk about evidence-based policy. I talk about evidence-based policy. At the same time, I think as a society, we're experiencing a loss of faith in science. And one can see this readily in some of the climate change experiences. And I mean, part of the argument about the loss of faith in science is that there are merchants of doubt. This is the title of a book by Oration, who deliberately manufacture doubt in people's minds, and it contributes to this sort of societal loss of faith in science. I would suggest, however, that we also potentially contribute to a loss of faith in science because we don't own our own values and we don't own the fact that all science is politically driven and is inherently political. And if we were better at owning that as researchers who aim to make a difference, we may find that people are perhaps less sceptical about what it is that we do. We are active participants in all of this, whether we like it or not. We shape knowledge and we disseminate knowledge in all sorts of active ways. Thank goodness that we do. I feel enormously privileged to have had this particular career, which will continue despite being the James Rankin Orator. It's been an enormous privilege to be able to do this work, but I think with that privilege comes significant responsibility. Thank you very much.